All right, let's jump right in today. We're tackling a topic that's been making headlines and sparking debate around the world, tariffs.
Definitely a hot topic, and it's one that's often misunderstood.
Yeah, you've sent me a ton of stuff on this, articles, research, even some personal notes you've jotted down. Looks like we've got a lot to unpack.
There is. And it's not just about the numbers, it's about global power dynamics, relationships between countries, and even America's future on the world stage.
Okay, so that's the big picture stuff. But let's start with the basics. What exactly are tariffs, and why are they causing so much tension?
So basically, a tariff is a tax on imported goods.
Okay, simple enough. But why would a country want to make imported goods more expensive?
Well, there are a few reasons. One is to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. If you make imported goods more expensive, it can give domestic producers an edge.
Makes sense. Kind of levels the playing field, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. Another reason is to generate revenue for the government. Tariffs are essentially a tax, and that money can be used to fund various programs or reduce the budget deficit.
Okay, so there's a financial incentive there. But it sounds like there are also potential downsides, especially if it makes things more expensive for consumers.
Absolutely. There are always trade-offs with tariffs, and that's what makes this whole discussion so complex.
All right, so we've got the basic idea of tariffs. Now let's dive into the specifics. We're focusing on the tariffs imposed by both President Trump and President Biden, especially how those are impacting our relationships with China, Canada, and Mexico.
Right. And it's important to remember that tariffs aren't a new thing. They've been used throughout history as a tool of economic and political strategy.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. President Trump's first term was really where we saw tariffs take center stage, right? He used them quite aggressively, especially with China.
Yeah, his America First agenda really put trade policy front and center. Remember those tariffs on steel and aluminum? 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. He argued it was about national security.
And those tariffs applied globally, right?
Yeah.
Not just to China.
Initially, yeah, though he did eventually exclude certain countries. But those steel and aluminum tariffs really rattled a lot of our allies, Canada and Mexico included.
Right, because we have so much trade back and forth with those countries.
Exactly. It created a lot of tension. Then there were the tariffs specifically on Chinese goods, a whole different ballgame. Those were imposed under what's called Section 301.
I'm not super familiar with trade law. What's Section 301 all about?
Basically, it allows the U.S. to impose tariffs if it determines that another country's trade practices are unfair or harmful to U.S. businesses.
Okay, so Trump used that to justify tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese products, right?
Yeah, it was a multi-phase approach, and the tariffs went up to 25% on some goods. The goal was to pressure China into changing its trade practices, things like intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer.
And that eventually led to the Phase 1 trade deal in 2020, right? Where China agreed to buy more American goods.
Exactly. Though that deal didn't resolve all the underlying issues, and many of those tariffs are still in place today.
So we've got these tariffs on steel, aluminum, and a massive amount of Chinese goods. Were there any other notable tariffs during Trump's first term?
Oh, there were a few others, like the tariffs on washing machines and solar panels.
I remember those. Those were meant to protect U.S. manufacturers, right?
Yeah, those were imposed under a different section of trade law, Section 201, which allows for tariffs to protect U.S. industries from what's deemed unfair competition. But those were smaller in scale compared to the China tariffs.
So Trump was definitely a big fan of using tariffs as a negotiating tool.
He was. It was a key part of his America First approach to trade.
Okay, fast forward to today. President Biden has taken a different approach to trade, right?
Well, he certainly toned down the rhetoric.
But has he actually rolled back any of those Trump-era tariffs?
Not many, actually. He's mostly kept them in place, arguing that they provide leverage in negotiations with China and other countries.
So even though he campaigned on a more multilateral approach to trade, he's basically sticking with Trump's playbook on tariffs.
In many ways, yes. Though Biden has used other tools as well, like the tariff rate quota system for steel and aluminum from certain countries.
Okay, so we've got all these tariffs in place, both from the Trump and Biden administrations. The big question is, have they achieved their goals? Have they made America more competitive, protected jobs, and reduced our trade deficit?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that economists and policymakers are still debating. It's a very complex issue with no easy answers. There have been some noticeable impacts, both positive and negative, but the overall picture is pretty murky.
Okay, so it's not a clear-cut win or loss. That's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. and a bit frustrating. We'll have to dig into the specifics and try to make sense of it all.
Exactly. It's not just about the economics either. It's about the impact on our relationships with other countries, the potential for retaliation, and the long-term consequences for the global trading system.
All right, so we've set the stage. We've got a lot to unpack here. Let's dive into some specific examples and try to figure out what's really going on.
Let's do it. Okay, so let's dive into those specifics. You mentioned it's not a clear win or loss with these tariffs. Where have we seen some of those impacts?
Well, one of the most obvious impacts is on prices, right? If you slap a tariff on an imported good, it's going to make that good more expensive for consumers.
Exactly. And we've seen that play out with a number of products, from washing machines to solar panels to steel.
Yeah, I remember reading that the price of washing machines went up by an average of $86 after the Trump administration imposed tariffs on imported washing machines.
Right. And those higher prices hit consumers in the pocketbook, especially those who are already struggling to make ends meet.
It's like a regressive tax in a way. It disproportionately affects lower-income households.
That's a good point. And it's something that policymakers need to be mindful of when they're considering tariffs. It's not just about protecting jobs or punishing up other countries. It's about the impact on real people.
Absolutely. So higher prices are one impact, but what about jobs? That was one of the main justifications for the tariffs, right? To protect American jobs.
Yeah, that was a big part of the argument. The idea was that by making imported goods more expensive, it would create a more level playing field for American companies and help to preserve jobs in the U.S.
And has that happened?
Yeah.
Have we seen a net increase in jobs as a result of the tariffs?
It's hard to say for sure. It's difficult to isolate the impact of the tariffs from other factors that are affecting the economy, but there have been some studies that suggest that the tariffs have had a mixed impact on jobs. Well, some industries have benefited while others have been hurt. For example, the steel industry has seen a boost in production and employment thanks to the tariffs on imported steel.
But other industries that use steel as an input, like the auto industry, have faced higher costs, which has made them less competitive and could lead to job losses down the road.
Right, it's a ripple effect. The impact of tariffs can be felt throughout the economy, not just in the specific industries that are targeted.
So it's not as simple as saying tariffs create jobs or tariffs destroy jobs. It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's important to look at the whole picture and to consider the long-term consequences, not just the immediate effects.
Okay, so prices and jobs are two big impacts. But what about the broader economic picture? Have the tariffs helped to reduce our trade deficit?
That was another one of the goals, right? To reduce the gap between how much we import and how much we export. But again, the evidence is mixed. Some studies suggest that the tariffs have had a minimal impact on the trade deficit, while others suggest that they've actually made it worse.
How could they make it worse?
Well, if the tariffs lead to higher prices for consumers, it could reduce consumer spending, which could then slow down economic growth. And if other countries retaliate with tariffs of their own, it could hurt U.S. exports.
So it's a delicate balance. And it's hard to predict how these things will play out in the long run.
Absolutely. The economy is a complex system, and there are a lot of moving parts. It's not always easy to isolate the impact of one specific policy, like tariffs.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic impacts, but what about the political impacts? The tariffs have definitely caused some tension with our trading partners, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The tariffs have strained relationships with China, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union.
It seems like they've created more conflict than cooperation.
Yeah, it's been a pretty contentious period in terms of trade relations, and it's not just about the economics, there's also a geopolitical dimension to this.
What do you mean?
Well, the tariffs are seen by some as a sign that the U.S. is retreating from its role as a leader in the global trading system. And that's created some anxiety among our allies who are wondering if they can still count on the U.S. to be a reliable partner.
So there's a sense that the U.S. is becoming more isolationist and protectionist.
That's how it's being perceived by some. And that's not necessarily a good thing. It could lead to a more fragmented world where countries are less willing to cooperate and where trade becomes a source of conflict rather than a force for peace and prosperity.
So the stakes are pretty high when it comes to trade policy. It's not just about dollars and cents. It's about global power dynamics and the future of the world order.
It is. And it's important to have a nuanced understanding of these issues. The decisions we make today about trade will have far-reaching consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic and political impacts of the tariffs, but let's zoom in on one specific issue that's been in the news a lot lately, the impact of the tariffs on the agricultural sector.
Agriculture has been hit particularly hard by the tariffs, especially the retaliatory tariffs that China imposed on U.S. agricultural products. Soybeans, Pork, corn, those are all targeted.
And those are major exports for American farmers, right?
Huge exports. China is a massive market for U.S. agricultural products, so when those tariffs were imposed, it really hurt. Farmers lost income, and some even went bankrupt.
So it's not just about abstract economic concepts. It's about real people's livelihoods.
Exactly. The tariffs have had a devastating impact on many farmers and rural communities. And it's not just the economic impact, there's also a psychological impact. Farmers are feeling stressed and uncertain about the future.
It's a tough situation. And it's one that's likely to continue as long as these trade tensions persist.
Yeah, it's a reminder that trade policy isn't just about numbers and statistics, it's about people's lives. And the decisions that policymakers make have real consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the impact on agriculture. But what about other industries? Are there any specific industries that have been helped by the tariffs?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, the steel industry has benefited. The tariffs have protected them from foreign competition and allowed them to increase production and employment.
But we also talked about how those tariffs have hurt other industries that use steel as an input, like the auto industry.
Right. It's a mixed bag. There are always winners and losers when it comes to tariffs. And it's important to consider the overall impact on the economy, not just the impact on specific industries.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the potential for retaliation. You mentioned that other countries have already retaliated with tariffs of their own.
Yeah, it's a classic example of tit for tat.
No.
One country imposes tariffs, and then the other country retaliates with tariffs of their own. And it can escalate quickly.
Leading to a trade war where everyone ends up worse off.
Exactly. Trade wars disrupt global trade flows, raise prices for consumers, and damage economies. They're not good for anyone.
So it's in everyone's best interest to avoid a trade war.
In theory, yes. But in practice, it can be difficult to de-escalate these tensions once they get started. There's often a lot of political pressure to stand firm and not be seen as backing down.
So it can be a slippery slope.
It can, and it's something that policymakers need to be very mindful of. They need to think carefully about the potential consequences of their actions and to avoid taking steps that could lead to an all-out trade war.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential for retaliation, but what about the longer-term implications of these tariffs? What kind of world are we creating here? Are we moving towards a more protectionist global trading system?
That's a big question, and it's one that a lot of people are worried about. The trend towards protectionism has been growing in recent years, and it's not just the U.S. We're seeing it in other countries as well.
What's driving this trend?
Well, there are a number of factors. One is the rise of populism and nationalism around the world. People are feeling anxious about globalization, and they're looking for leaders who promise to protect them from foreign competition.
So it's partly a reaction to the economic and social changes that have been brought about by globalization.
Exactly. People are feeling left behind, and they're looking for someone to blame.
And they're finding scapegoats in immigrants, foreigners, and trade deals.
Yeah, it's easy to point the finger at outsiders and to say that they're the ones who are taking our jobs and undermining our economy.
But that's a simplistic view that ignores the complexities of globalization and the benefits that it has brought.
It is. Globalization has lifted millions of people out of poverty around the world. It's created new opportunities for businesses and consumers, and it's fostered greater interconnectedness and understanding between different cultures.
But it's also had some negative consequences like job displacement and environmental degradation.
Right, it's not a perfect system, but the solution isn't to retreat into protectionism. That will only make things worse.
So what's the solution?
Well, it's complex, but it involves finding ways to manage the negative consequences of globalization while also preserving its benefits. It involves investing in education and training to help workers adapt to the changing economy. It involves promoting sustainable development practices, and it involves working together to address global challenges like climate change.
So it's not about building walls and retreating from the world.
No, it's about building bridges and working together to create a more just and sustainable global economy.
A strong voice in the trade debate. Yeah, labor unions.
They do tend to be more skeptical of free trade agreements than, say, businesses.
And why is that?
Well, one of the biggest concerns for unions is job losses. With companies potentially moving production to countries where wages are lower if there are fewer barriers to trade.
So it's about protecting those American jobs, making sure workers aren't left behind?
Exactly. It's about livelihoods too, right? It's not just about the jobs themselves. It's about the communities that rely on those jobs.
Right. Whole towns can be devastated if a major employer shuts down or moves overseas.
Exactly. And that's why unions often push for things like tariffs to protect domestic industries. And they've also been strong advocates for including labor and environmental standards in trade agreements.
So they're not necessarily against trade altogether. They just want to make sure it's fair trade.
Yeah, fair trade is a big part of it. They want to make sure that trade benefits workers, not just corporations,
Hmm.
and that it doesn't lead to a race to the bottom on wages and working conditions.
So it's a balancing act, right? Trying to find ways to promote trade while also protecting workers and the environment.
It is. And that's why these trade negotiations are so complex. There are a lot of different interests at play, and it's not always easy to find solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about businesses, labor unions. What about the role of consumers in all of this?
Consumers are often the forgotten stakeholders in the trade debate, even though they're the ones who are ultimately impacted by these policies.
Right, they're the ones who end up paying higher prices for goods and services if tariffs are imposed.
Exactly. And they might also face reduced choice if certain imported goods become unavailable or too expensive.
So it's important to remember that trade policy isn't just about abstract economic concepts. It's about real people and the choices they have.
Absolutely. It's about what's available on the shelves at the grocery store. It's about the price of clothes and electronics. It's about the cost of living in general.
So consumers have a stake in this debate, even if they're not always aware of it.
They do. And they can make their voices heard by contacting their elected officials, by making informed choices about what they buy, and by supporting organizations that advocate for fair trade practices.
So we all have a role to play in shaping the future of trade.
We do. It's not just up to governments and corporations, it's up to all of us.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about the complexities of trade and the challenges we face.
It's a complex topic for sure, but it's one that's worth understanding because it affects so many aspects of our lives.
And I hope our listeners are feeling more informed and empowered to engage in this important debate.
That's the goal, to spark thoughtful discussions and to encourage people to think critically about these issues.
So to wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
That trade is about more than just economics. It's about people. It's about jobs and livelihoods. It's about communities and the environment. It's about our interconnected world.
It's about finding ways to create a more just and sustainable global economy that benefits everyone.
Exactly. And that requires us to engage in thoughtful dialogue, to consider different perspectives, and to work together to find solutions.
Well said. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.